So I'm a philosopher at the Ayn Rand Institute, and I want to take you into, I think, one of the more philosophical topics that you'll hear from us this weekend, the moral foundations of capitalism. And when you talk about a foundation of something, you're talking about doing a little digging deeper into the explanations of the important principles in question. So to help us identify the moral foundations of capitalism, I want to start by presenting to you a couple of examples, and then I'm going to ask you a question about these examples. So suppose you're an author and you're planning a new book, but you receive word from the government that your book will be subject to censorship. If it doesn't say the right things, if it doesn't agree with the official government doctrine, certain parts of it might be edited out. Maybe the whole book will be banned. Now, I think you'll find that if something like this happens to an author in most any country in the Western world, there will be uproar. There will be outrage. Activists will come to your defense to say, your right to the freedom of speech is being violated. That's case number one. But now consider case number two. Suppose you are a builder. You want to design a gleaming new high-rise complex for an apartment building. But you are told this time by the government that if you do that, and if you want to rent out apartments, you'll, I don't know, just hypothetically, only be able to sign leases of 3 years. And the increases in rent will be indexed to the wages of the renters and to inflation. That should sound familiar to you, of course, because that's exactly what the recently repealed rental law in Argentina did. However, if that's the kind of regulation you're faced with, unlike the other case, what you'll find is that nobody will come to your defense, not on the same kinds of grounds that the victim of censorship was. Nobody will say that you have a right that's being violated on the grounds similar to the right to the freedom of speech. And the question I want to ask today is, why is that? Why is one of these kinds of activities protected by rights and seen as being protected by rights in a dominant way, but the other one is not? What explains the difference between the way these activities are regarded and protected? And whatever that reason is it a good reason? Should it be that way? Well, I hope you get from the fact that I'm arguing for the moral foundations of capitalism that I don't think it should be that way, that this is an unjustified disparity. But to be able to do that digging, here's what I plan to talk about today. First, I want to look at some of the reasons that people give for why they see a difference between economic freedom and intellectual freedom, why the second is protected by rights but not by the first. Then we'll look at some of the issues that underlie that and that I think will attack the disparity that people see. We'll look at the moral status of business. We'll look at the conditions, the social conditions that business requires if it is to function. And we'll then close by reflecting on the role of the capitalist system in protecting the economic freedom that I think really should be protected. Okay. So what are the reasons that people say they treat these activities differently? Why do they see an opposition between economic freedom and intellectual freedom? Well, let's take a look at a case of an intellectual doing his work, the kind that is well regarded, the best kind of intellectual you could think of, somebody who's a creative artist writing an original novel. People will regard their work as worthy of protection because they see what the artist or what the intellectual or what the scientist is doing as a kind of morally admirable pursuit of some noble goal, an elevated, maybe spiritual kind of activity. This is a view of intellectuals people in the West have had for centuries, if not millennia, perhaps going all the way back to ancient Greece. But there's one more point that's important here. It's that it's not just a noble goal they're going for. There's some sense, in some inarticulate way, that in order for them to achieve that goal, there are certain special conditions that people who are pursuing the truth need to be left free to explore if they are actually to attain it. This is one of the reasons why there's been widespread recognition of freedom of speech and other forms of intellectual freedom in the West. It's why, for instance, there's a First Amendment to the United States Constitution, which includes protection for intellectual freedoms like freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of religious worship, and why in the 1853 Constitution of Argentina, you have similar protections for freedom of speech in Article 14, from what I've learned. Okay, so take a step back for a moment and let's try to abstract what these 2 points are saying, because I think these are the common views. What does this have to do with why we see this as protected by right? Well, any kind of right is going to be a right that describes a freedom to do something and a freedom from something. And in the case of intellectual freedom, the idea is there's some morally admirable goal you should be free to do, and there's some kind of obstacle in society that could prevent you from attaining that goal. You need to be free to pursue that goal and free from that obstacle. These are the ideas that inform people's belief in intellectual freedom. Now I'll bring Ayn Rand in for the first time in this talk. She gives a definition of the concept of a right that I think captures the basic idea here that people have about why there is such a thing as a right to free speech. She writes, "A right is a moral principle defining and sanctioning a man's freedom of action in a social context. Thus, for every individual, a right is the moral sanction of a positive. His rights impose no obligation on others except of a negative kind, to abstain from violating his rights." And so in that same passage, you can see those same 2 criteria that I just mentioned, criteria for what it is to have the right to a certain kind of freedom, the freedom to do something and the freedom from something else. The idea you need to have the freedom to do something morally positive, the moral sanction of a positive, and you need to be free from some kind of violations by other people. We'll say more later about what precisely Rand thinks that violation consists in. Now, it should be obvious by now that Ayn Rand doesn't think there's this kind of disparity, this opposition between intellectual freedom and economic freedom in the way the conventional view holds. But, obviously, a lot of people disagree with her. And why is that? Why do they think that the businessman, why do they think economic activity is not worthy of protection by rights in the way that intellectual activity is? Well, on those same 2 points, you simply have different views. Business activity is, instead of being regarded as morally admirable pursuit of a noble goal, is regarded as a kind of materialistic, animalistic pursuit of a greedy, selfish, ignoble end. It's thought to be just about stuff, just about money, just about grabbing what's right in front of you. And of course, it's also thought to be only for yourself to the exclusion of others. It's thought to be that you are expropriating others' things if you are a businessman. Wealth is thought to be this static quantity that's only transferred from person to person. So this is why we, in the United States in the 19th century, called our industrialists robber barons, because the perception was they were just taking things from the poor, who were their customers and their workers. So that's one point. It's not regarded as morally admirable. But second, and I think an underappreciated aspect of the reason for this opposition, is that it's also thought there aren't really any special conditions that business requires to keep in business. Businessmen who are seen as necessarily, automatically pursuing their self-interest are thought to do so relentlessly. You can throw up any obstacle you want against them, and they'll keep doing it. They'll figure out a way to keep delivering the goods. It's sometimes even portrayed as a kind of instinct on their part. No special skills or knowledge required. Well, if that's your view of what business activity consists in, it's pretty clear then why you wouldn't think it should be protected by rights. Because you don't think it's pursuing a morally admirable goal, and you also don't think it requires any special conditions for its existence. The big question, of course, is if either of these points is actually true. Obviously, I am arguing, and Ayn Rand argued, that they're not. She saw this opposition between economic and intellectual freedom as a false opposition. She saw the intellectual and the businessman not as opponents of each other, but as two types, when perfected, should be natural allies. She thought both were created during the professional intellectual and the professional businessman were born of the Industrial Revolution, are natural allies, and should learn to understand each other. The question is why. She summed up her position on this issue in a pithy statement, which is, I think, widely known and attributed to her. A free mind and a free market are corollaries. You can't have one without the other. Economic and intellectual liberty are inevitably bound up together. I'm going to come back to this quotation later and show you the wider context of what she's saying that leads up to it. That's going to help explain a lot about what's her reasoning on this one. So she thinks that whatever you can say that's true about the importance of intellectual freedom, also true about economic freedom. And I want to go through each of these two and show how those two criteria of rights that we've just looked at apply to each. So let's talk about the morality of business by first comparing it to that well-regarded activity in our culture, the job of the intellectual. What is the job of an intellectual? Let's take, again, the best cases, because there are some that aren't so good. What's widely recognized is that if you're an intellectual, like a novelist, you engage in reading and research and imagination in order to learn how to express some important truth about human nature, in order to learn your craft, in order to learn how to devise a plot, so that you can eventually put pen to paper and bring it into existence for the world to consume. These are the kind of stereotypical ideas about what the job of an intellectual is, and they're true. Slightly less well appreciated is the fact that, well, if you actually want to live the life of a writer, you need to sell books. You need to make money selling books. Otherwise, you're not living the life of a writer. You need to do it in a way that's self-sustaining. It's possible to write books as a hobby, where you're not depending on the proceeds from it. Of course, even then, you're not living the life of a writer, you're living the life as something else, somebody who writes on the side, and even then you're still relying on the publishing industry to sell you the books that you're going to read in order to hone your craft. There are, of course, some people who would like to simply receive a subsidy from the state, not have to sell the books in order to be a writer. But they then, of course, are relying on somebody else's profit-seeking and money-making to be able to do that, the people who pay the taxes to fund the subsidy. And then these writers who demand subsidies usually have the audacity to claim to be independent artists, even though they are relying on this parasitism of somebody else's creation. So what do these stages represent? Again, let's take a step back and abstract a bit to see what these really amount to. The best of artists and intellectuals engage in rational thinking in order to learn things about the truth, in order to use their industry and their technology, in this case the publishing industry, in order to make a profit. But when you put it that way, and you describe it at this level, it should be clear that this is no different from what the businessmen do. Now, everybody, of course, knows the last part about the businessman. Everybody knows business is about selling products to make money. What's usually less well appreciated is everything that goes into doing that. And we heard some of that discussed in today's panel, which included a number of builders. Less well appreciated is the fact that a lot of reading and research and imagination also goes into the creating of a product, to learning the value of the product, to identifying some market segment that demands the product, to learning how to produce it, how to finance it, how to market it. For the businessman, this also often includes, well, it necessarily includes integrating all of these different factors of production into a single project, which usually means finding all the people who know how to create these factors of production, to put them together on a single team in order to deliver it. It's a highly intellectual activity. And the thing to note here, and really to emphasize, is not that, it's what I'm saying is not simply that there's an underappreciated intellectual aspect to business. What I'm saying is that it is an essentially intellectual activity, and intellectual activity of the most elevated and important type. In Ayn Rand's view, the intellect, the mind, the faculty that allows you to grasp the truth about the world, is not valuable simply because, or is not valuable because of some pursuit of truth for its own sake, which is another way of saying pursuit of truth because it's useless. Why would that be valuable? Her view is that the pursuit of knowledge of the truth is valuable because it serves life, because it serves the purpose of life. And that is embodied in the intellectual problem solving of the businessman, probably better than any other activity, again, because of the way in which all these factors of production have to be integrated. Knowledge is power. Whether we're talking about the simplest shelter in a cave somewhere to the highest high-rise building, from planting the first seeds in agriculture to the most sophisticated biotechnology that we use today. This is what we mean when we say that the mind is the motor of the world. And one implication, the most important implication of this, is that it helps show why that characterization of the businessman's activity as animalistic, as grubby, as materialistic, is the furthest thing from the truth that you could imagine. When you think about the way the businessman has to discover so many facts about a market, has to create a product, bring into the world something that didn't exist before, it's much more like the businessman is the hand of a god shaping the earth in accordance with his values than he is like an animal. And because of the fact that he's not an animal, because he's using his mind to create wealth that did not exist before, that means he's not expropriating it from someone. He's not taking it from somebody. You can't take from someone what they did not create. It's not expropriation. It is creation. Now let's think about what some of the implications of this are for the morality of business. You can already see how a number of moral virtues are embodied in the activity that we've just discussed. We've talked about rationality, the relentless pursuit of truth based on the facts, regardless of your feelings to the contrary. Rational pursuit of the truth. Truth is a noble goal, especially if it serves life. There's independent judgment as opposed to conformity involved in the pursuit of business. Being the first to see something that no one else dared to see and to bring it into the world. There's integrity, because when you bring it into the world for the first time, you often face opposition. People who don't believe you'll be able to do it. People who want to put up obstacles. You have to fight for your vision of the truth. And very importantly, there's justice. Because what a businessman is doing is offering a value, a new value that he's created, in exchange for the values of others. It's not expropriation, it's trade. And that is the essence of justice. Okay, but these are virtues. What are these virtues actually good for? These are actions that we take in order to achieve a certain end. What is the end? Why are these good? What are they good for? Well, there's some difference of opinion on this question. We've seen some of it today, I think, already. There are some who say, not going to mention any names, but let's call this the World Economic Forum argument, that businessmen are social benefactors. Why? Well, first, most importantly, because they create a product, a good or a service that is of value to the customers, to the other people they are serving. And secondarily, because in the act of creating this product, they raise the general level of prosperity, they create jobs, they cause that hockey stick growth of GDP over the last few hundred years. Now, this is true. These effects are real. The question is, what is their moral relevance? I think that the World Economic Forum argument is a defensive argument. It's one that is trying to appease the predominant morality, the view that says morality is concerned with serving other people. I think it's true that business serves other people in this way, but that's not what morally justifies it. After all, this isn't what actually motivates businessmen to engage in their activity. And everybody knows it. Morality is about assessing intentions. It's about assessing the purpose that a person's pursuing. And so if you say, well, business is about social benefits, it's a defensive argument that's not really going to win because people know that's not what businessmen are concerned with. They're concerned with profit. They want to make money. And the question is, what's wrong with that? And why hide that fact? Why be defensive about it? Why be apologetic about it? After all, given what we've said, the businessman is creating a product using his mind. He's gaining wealth for what he's created. Isn't it an act of justice to pay him for what he created? Why is it an act of justice to reward someone, to benefit someone who didn't create something? No rational reason has ever been given for this idea. Now, of course, it's true that from profits, a business person can enjoy their life more. There are comforts that they can enjoy because of it. But the wealthier you become, there's only so much money that you can spend on comforts and luxury. We all know that most of what a businessman does with his profits is to reinvest it in his business and invest it in other people's business. And the reason I bring this up is not to say, well, this helps the economy, though it does. I bring it up because it's a sign of the true enjoyment that the businessman takes from his work. It's not the material comforts, which are real and important. It's the enjoyment of the work itself. A businessman wants to create business. He wants to do his job. He enjoys his job. He uses the money to do more of his job. It's a kind of virtuous circle where thinking creates wealth, wealth allows you to do more thinking, which creates wealth. And yes, this is selfish. It's for his benefit, the benefit of his love for his work. But this is virtuous selfishness, this kind of virtuous circle between productive, rational thinking, creation, consumption, and more of the same. So I hope you can see from what I'm giving you so far, we looked at the case that they make for intellectual freedom. The idea that it's a morally admirable activity, that it needs certain conditions to survive. The case for intellectual freedom is the case for economic freedom, because both of these are true for economic freedom as well. We've talked about why it is a morally admirable activity in pursuit of a noble goal. The last major thing I'll talk about is why the second point is true as well, why there are socially important conditions required for business activity. So before I said people who believe in intellectual freedom think that the intellectual needs to be given a special freedom in order to explore, in order to gain and attain that truth. But that's a bit foggy, a little metaphorical. Let's call a spade and be very literal. What kind of freedom to explore we're talking about? What we're talking about is freedom from physical force. We need freedom from physical force because our minds don't just function in isolation from the world. You might think, but your mind is in your head. It's a private thing. Who can ever stop it? And it's true that you can't force somebody to think, but you can destroy their ability to think because part of what thinking requires is action in the world. Part of what you do to test the truth of your thinking is to go out in the world and do tests. If you're a researcher gathering data, or a scientist doing experiments, or a journalist writing articles to see what kind of results they get, they require action in the world to test for the truth. And force removes the mind from the possibility of that action. Force says, no, you can't go out there in the world and test your thinking. We're either going to physically restrain you, or we're going to threaten you with some kind of destruction if you do. Which means your judgment about what life requires is negated. You think your life requires both your money and your life, but the hold-up man says you have to make a choice, your money or your life. Economic activity also requires the same kind of freedom for all the reasons we've talked about. Because it's an intellectual activity, especially because it is the essential kind of intellectual activity that involves judgment about the requirements of life. Think about all of those kinds of complex, delicate, intellectual actions that are required to do something like build a building. All those different factors of production that needed to be integrated. If you're stopped, let's say, from charging the kind of rent that you want, you won't be able to get the feedback of the market mechanism, which is a price, which tells you something about the demand out there in the market. If you can't think about what the market actually demands, you can't think about how to supply what's demanded. And if you can't think about that, then you can't think about why you're even doing this activity. What's the purpose? When you're stopped from thinking about your own purpose, you therefore lose motivation. And everyone knows this point about the fact that regulations disincentivize. It's exactly what happened because of the rental law in Argentina. When landlords weren't able to charge the rate that they desired on the terms that they wanted, what did they do? They pulled units off of the market. The supply of housing went down. And as a consequence, it was very hard to find housing in Argentina. And from what I understand, as soon as they repealed this law some weeks ago, the supply of housing has increased, not too surprisingly. So let me go back to that passage from Ayn Rand where she states that a free mind and free markets are corollaries. I'll give you the wider context for that quotation. She says, reason requires freedom, self-confidence, and self-esteem. It requires the right to think and to act on the guidance of one's thinking, the right to live by one's own independent judgment. Intellectual freedom cannot exist without political freedom. Political freedom cannot exist without economic freedom. A free mind and a free market are corollaries. If you look at the part I have in boldface, I think it's really important. Because what it stresses is that the reason they're corollaries is that you can't have a right to think without the right to act on it, on the guidance of one's own thinking. That's what economic freedom is needed to secure, the ability to act on your thinking, to make it real, robust, reality oriented thinking. So the last thing I'll say a word or two about is the role of the capitalist system in protecting economic freedom. And here, one last quotation from Ayn Rand, starting with her definition of what capitalism actually is. Capitalism is a social system based on the recognition of individual rights, including property rights, in which all property is privately owned. In a capitalist society, no man or group may initiate the use of physical force against others. The only function of the government in such a society is the task of protecting man's rights, the task of protecting him from physical force. Two things to notice about what she says here. The first is the centrality of property rights. Property rights are the essential way that a capitalist system protects economic freedom. Why? Because property rights are what define the material resources you need to be able to act with, that you need to be able to control and dispose of if you are to engage in these long-term activities essentially involved in business that constitute the life of a businessman, ultimately the life of human being. So capitalism protects economic freedom by protecting property rights, among other individual rights. And the second thing to note about this is that that's a positive, important job for government to do. Capitalism requires, it's not just consistent with, but capitalism requires a government to protect rights, especially a government that protects property rights, which cannot be done unless property rights are defined, unless property rights are identified, unless property rights, the lines that they draw around each person's life are explicitly and clearly defined so that they can be protected and enforced by a government agency. The thesis I'll close with, and this is the thesis that sums up my talk, is that the defense of capitalism, which is the system of economic freedom, can be defended only by defending the morality of material production and the need for freedom from physical force. It's a thesis that I think identifies what the moral foundations of capitalism is. These are foundations that are crucially important for us to understand if we're intellectuals, if we're philosophers, but I think especially if we are businessmen and we want to know on what our activities and our lives depend. Thank you. ¿15?
Bueno, muchas gracias, Aben. Vamos a tener 15 minutos para hacer un par de preguntas, así que como siempre se pueden acercar aquí el micrófono o a este y después se viene la gran charla.
Again, let me know if you're going to do this in English or Spanish so I can turn this.
Pueden hacer las preguntas en español también, que tiene la traducción simultánea.
Hope it's working. I'm not sure yet. I haven't heard anybody talk yet.
Hi, Ben. How are you?
Good.
Great talk. Thank you very much. One of my favorites so far. So I have a question. What would be a good argument to protect individuals from producing goods that can harm those who consume it? Example, drugs, junk food.
Okay. Well, the essential principle here is that there's two. One is there is such a thing as the crime of fraud. And so part of what you do when you protect individual rights in a capitalist system is the essential thing you do is you forbid force. You forbid physical force. But there are direct and there are indirect forms of physical force. Somebody who grabs you, that's direct force. Somebody who merely threatens you by saying your money or your life, that's indirect force. Another example of indirect force is fraud, where I maybe never lay any hands on you, just like the threatening with a gun doesn't lay any hands on you, but what I do is I misrepresent what it is I'm giving you. There has to be consent for there to be freedom from force. And so if someone says, this is a perfectly healthy a bottle of water, but it's actually, I don't know, turpentine, they're not delivering the goods that they said they would. So one point is there need to be laws against fraud, and that's part and parcel of protecting freedom and protecting individual rights. The second thing to say is caveat emptor, that what government exists to do is to prohibit fraud, but that is not something that you legislate against in specific detail in advance. There are always going to be misunderstandings on the market. There are always going to be non-optimal products. The fact that somebody sells me a sweater that's a size a little too small, let's say, doesn't mean they've committed fraud. It means maybe I didn't do enough diligence to figure out what exactly it was that I was buying. And so there is an obligation on the part of the consumer to do sufficient diligence to find out what they're buying. Now, I think in our current society, we're disincentivized from doing that because we have the assumption that the government's going to do it all for us. And yet, if you know anything about regulatory agencies that are supposed to be looking for consumer protection, this is often the last thing on their mind. They've set some kind of arbitrary level of compliance. The industry usually knows what actually delivers a quality product, and the government bureaucrats are really just concerned with covering their ass. So we need to remove them from that activity so that we can be the ones to judge for ourselves, and that the businesses can be the ones to judge for themselves what a quality product is, because they know if they deliver on bad products, people won't want to buy them, they'll lose their reputation, they'll go out of business.
Vamos ahí.
Acá le hago una pregunta, profesor Bayer, luego de su admirable...
Un segundo, vamos a chequear ahí que esté la traducción simultánea. Sí, ahí va.
Hola, hola. Sí, profesor Bayer, luego de su admirable exposición sobre los fundamentos del capitalismo, que agradecemos, le hago la siguiente pregunta. Es un hecho que en el mundo capitalista y también en Argentina hay cada vez una creciente demanda social justamente de la sociedad hacia los empresarios y las empresas. Algunos atribuyen esto a una mutación del capitalismo, de un capitalismo de shareholders, de accionistas o dueños, a un capitalismo de stakeholders, en el cual hay muchos grupos de interés interesados en satisfacer que las empresas satisfagan de alguna manera sus necesidades. Esto también se puede ver en foros mundiales como la OCDE, que ha emitido una serie de documentos al respecto, y también en los gobiernos de las empresas, en los directorios, en los boards y demás. ¿Cuál es su opinión al respecto?
Right. Okay, so it's a question about shareholder capitalism versus stakeholder capitalism, and why are companies being pressured to engage in the second? Why are they being pressured to engage in social responsibility more generally? And I mean, not for any good reason is what I would say. One of the major points of my speech is that there's this negative attitude about the very moral status of business activity, that it's thought businessmen are not creating wealth but expropriating it. Well, if that's your view, then you often get the slogan leveled against business that it's time for them to give back to society. To the society that gave them their customers, to the society that built the roads and the bridges that President Obama was talking about when he said, you didn't build that, society helped you. And so what's at the bottom of it, first of all, is this false view of what business actually is that doesn't see business as a wealth creation, but as a form of expropriation. But more generally, it's just another way of saying that the Judeo-Christian ethic of selfless sacrifice applies to business as much as it does to anything else. It's the view that says all of us don't justify our existence unless we are sacrificing to others. This is the form in which businessmen are expected to do it. And I think it's important to challenge that moral view. That's what Ayn Rand did. That's what I was doing a little bit here to indicate how she did it today.
Vamos a hacer solo 2 más preguntas. Lo siento, yo sé que hay muchos que quieren preguntar y demás, pero estamos un poco justos con la agenda y tenemos que empezar con el protocolo ahora a 3:30, así que vamos a hacer una más acá y una más ahí. ¿Vale? 2 more questions, Ben.
All right. So for example, like rights like freedom to speech, and you have companies that limit that, like Twitter used to do that, like how should the government kind of, ideally in this capitalist system, protect these rights for these businesses that at one point I think they get a lot of power that it seemed like in Twitter's case they were working on behalf of the government. So it seems like in practice you're always going to have this crony capitalism.
Okay, so 2 things to say about that. First is the principle, and second is the somewhat tricky application. The principle here is that if what you have is a free market, and if a company has gained influence in that market through honest trade, providing value for value, by building a social media platform that creates an entire network effect of people who want to join on it, they've created that platform, they've given that platform to people for free. And the mere fact that a company decides there are going to be rules for what gets to be posted to the platform or not is not censorship. It's not a violation of free speech. It is an exercise of property rights. It's the company saying these are the terms on which you get to use our private property. So that's the principle that's important here. And so it's not censorship when someone puts out those rules. Now, the tricky part of understanding what happened at Twitter and perhaps at some other social media companies is to what extent were any of those kinds of terms and conditions imposed because they were pressured by the government to impose them. And I mean, I certainly think it is possible for there to be such a thing as kind of indirect censorship by proxy where a company is acting under fear that some kind of law will be passed, that it will be penalized unless it imposes these conditions. And I think that would count as an indirect form of censorship. I'm not going to take a position on whether that actually happened at Twitter. I know there's some evidence suggesting it might have. I don't know if that's definitive evidence. But that's the question you would have to settle if you wanted to determine if that was some kind of indirect form of censorship. Were they really acting under duress from the government? Or, which is also possible, were the executives at Twitter at that time simply in agreement with the policies that the government was recommending? Now, my view is that government should never even be talking to the businesses in the first place so that there can be no ambiguity whatsoever about what's happening. But as to the specific facts, I'll have to leave that to the judicial system to decide.
Vamos con la última pregunta, ahí. Last question, Ben.
Hi, Ben. Pleasure to meet you. Hearing your talk and also hearing the talk from Agustina, it kind of unearths on me like some sort of contradiction, and maybe on my question you can help me understand that. When we allow organizations to own a property, aren't we enabling collectivism? Because the decisions regarding those properties will require voting or consensus.
No. But I understand why you're asking that, because there's a sense in which a business is, there's a loose sense in which a business is a collective. It's a group of people who are functioning together in concert for the attainment of some commonly shared end. But that is a loose sense of collective, and it's not a strict sense. The kind of collectivism that objectivism opposes is not simply the view that there are groups of people who do things together sometimes. It's the view that there's a kind of metaphysical primacy in the group, that individuals are less than real, that they're determined and programmed by the greater whole of which they are a part, whether it's the state or the nation or the race or the species. That's collectivism. Collectivism is this metaphysical view. The major essence of individualism is the idea that no, you're not determined and programmed by the greater whole. You're an individual human being with free will who can decide to go your separate way from any group you like. And as long as there's the possibility of being able to disagree and go your separate way, you're not a member of a collective, you are an individual. And the relevant point here for corporations is, yes, they're groups of people, but when they're done well, they operate by voluntary choice. Nobody has to work for a corporation. Nobody has to buy from a corporation. Nobody has to be on its board of directors. If you don't like what they do, you can quit your job, stop buying their products, start up your own company, your own group of people to do something in common. So as long as it's composed of consenting adults, it's not a collective. And this issue, by the way, about what the essence of individualism is, that it's essentially about being able to decide for yourself to go your separate way, that's going to be very important for the talk that I give tomorrow. So stay tuned.
Thank you, Ben. Big round of applause. Fuerte aplauso para Ben.